Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Thursday, July 10th, day 643 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me again after a bit of an absence from the daily briefing. Nice to have you back.
Hi, Amanda. It's good to be back.
Even as ceasefire hostage release negotiations appear to be ongoing in Doha, the war in Gaza continues. Manny will fill us in on what's happening on the ground, as well as new ground operations this week in Lebanon and Syria. We'll also learn more details about the tragic deaths of the IDF soldiers who fell this week. All this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military correspondent, Emanuel Fabian. There were several casualties this week in Gaza, and the war continues. So, Manny, let's hear first where the IDF is operating, and then we'll speak about the tragic incidents. And as I mentioned, the negotiations in Doha are speaking about where the IDF will draw down to. But in the meantime, I understand that the IDF has basically achieved the goal of capturing some 70% of the Strip. So that means the IDF is holding in those locations in 70% of the Strip right now?
The IDF is holding on to more or less 70% of Gaza. The goal before this operation was 75%, so it may achieve this before a deal may be reached, probably within the next week or two, perhaps, if, of course, there's no deal immediately. And the main sort of areas of operation right now are in Khan Yunis, in southern Gaza, an area where the army operated in previously, but not intensively, at least in the past year, and in the northern part of Gaza, in the Beit Hanoun area, where several soldiers were killed in an ambush earlier this week, which we'll talk about. The army is now encircling that area and working to essentially clear it of the remaining operatives who have remained holed up there. There are no civilians in those areas. It's essentially all just demolished buildings there, but there are still several dozens of operatives still holed up in those areas. And there's also operations in areas, I would say, east of Gaza City, so sort of near Gaza City, but close to the Israeli border. And in Rafah, the army is still sort of doing mop-up operations, but there's been, as far as I can recall, no fighting in Rafah, at least in the past several weeks, maybe even in the past month or so. No major fighting there. I think the main sort of hotspots is Khan Yunis and Beit Hanoun in the strips north.
So on Monday, Defense Minister Israel Katz unveiled this plan for Rafah, but it sounds like the plan of creating a city on the rubble of the city or to clear away the city has not yet commenced. Is that correct, Manny?
So Rafah is mostly destroyed already. Pretty much all the buildings there are either damaged or completely razed. And that's something the army's been doing for a long time. It's not a recent thing, but the whole idea of establishing a new sort of camp there for Palestinians, he called it a humanitarian city, where he wants the entire civilian population to be sort of away from Hamas. From what I understand, from what he said, is that sort of constructing that and doing that whole project would really only take place during a ceasefire. So a ceasefire is announced, and then during that time they'd be able to establish this and get people to move in. They can't do it during combat operations in Gaza. But that's Katz's idea, and the defense ministry and the army have been instructed to sort of figure out the plans for that. But if there is a deal, then and if under the deal Israel is allowed to remain in the Morag corridor area, which is north of Rafah, and this tent camp of humanitarian city of sorts, whatever you want to call it, will be established south of the corridor, in an area where the army is, I suppose, in control. But Katz said that the army wouldn't be the one running it, rather some other international organization, perhaps GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, in charge of the aid distribution sites. They might be the ones involved in that project.
We saw delivery this week of a slew of military-grade bulldozers. Do you feel like they're earmarked for this project, or was this on the horizon in any case?
Oh, these were ordered a long time ago. The army realized that it was, I guess, running low on these armored bulldozers, not because they were losing them, but because they didn't have enough beforehand. They didn't realize the scale of operations that they would have to be doing, which is also the reason why the army has opened one already new combat engineering battalion during the war, and it's planning on opening a second one, so there'll be 5 in total, really scaling up the combat engineering. So during the war, the defense ministry ordered, I think it was 130 more D9 bulldozers. I don't know exactly how many arrived yesterday. They said dozens arrived, but it might not have been the full order. And then these are essentially full Gaza operations, but they were ordered during the Biden administration. They were held up for a while by the previous administration, and the Trump administration basically released it. So it might not have been sort of based on that, but the army in general has been looking to get more armored bulldozers, more combat engineers.
Okay, so this transitions into one of the casualties this week, and an Israeli soldier was killed during an abduction attempt by terrorists who are also attempted to snatch his body in the southern Gaza Strip yesterday. He was named as Master Sergeant in Reserves Abraham Azulay. He was 25. He'd just gotten married 3 months ago, and he was a heavy engineering operator in the Southern Command's Combat Engineering Unit. He hails from the West Bank settlement of Yitzhar. So, what do we know about this incident? Was he on one of these bulldozers? Was he accomplishing essentially what Katz was laying out on Monday? What happened during this incident?
So this happened actually in Khan Yunis, not in Rafah, so not in the area where Katz's plan, or his vision at least. He was operating an excavator, so for similar tasks, for demolishing buildings. Something that the army has been doing throughout the war is demolishing buildings that Hamas has used, or are booby-trapped, or pose a threat, because buildings generally can be used by Hamas to stage attacks on troops. And basically during this his excavation operations in Khan Yunis, a group of, or a cell of, Hamas operatives emerged from a tunnel. They then essentially jumped on the excavator and tried to abduct him. And according to the army's probe, he fought back and basically struggled with the Hamas operatives, preventing himself from being abducted. But during this, he was shot and killed by the Hamas operatives. And they also tried to, as far as I understand from the army's investigation, to also make off with his body. But other soldiers stationed in the area, essentially the forces who were guarding the engineering operation, they returned fire, managing to hit some of them, not all of them, and preventing at least his abduction. But of course, he was killed in the incident.
So that's kind of my question, Manny. It sounds as though these individuals are working on the heavy machinery, which is armored itself, and then there are teams guarding them at the same time. Is that what's going on?
That's correct. I'm not sure if this excavator was actually armored. The D9 bulldozers, of course, as we've mentioned, those are armored bulldozers. 2 soldiers operate them together. They're armed themselves, and there's also forces securing them around them. But these excavators are a bit more stationary when they, try to destroy a building, and so in those cases there are forces that do sort of guard the surrounding area. We don't know really further details on what exactly happened, how these Hamas operatives managed to get so close to this excavator and try and abduct the soldier, and how it wasn't stopped at an earlier time. I'm sure the army is investigating that now and working to prevent such a case in the future. But it is, I would say, a relatively rare incident of Hamas. I mean, Hamas always tries to abduct soldiers. It's not a new thing that they've been trying, but to get this close, I think, is something that's been relatively rare.
Okay, let's turn to an incident earlier in the week in which 5 Israeli soldiers were killed and 14 were wounded too seriously by roadside bombs in Beit Hanoun, which is in the northern Gaza Strip. The slain soldiers were named as Staff Sergeant Meir Shimon Amar, 20, from Jerusalem; Sergeant Moshe Nissim Frech, 20, from Jerusalem; Staff Sergeant Noam Aharon Musgadian, 20, from Jerusalem; Staff Sergeant Moshe Shmuel Noll, 21, from Beit Shemesh; and Sergeant First Class Benyamin Asulin, 28, from Haifa. He was in the reserves. Manny, what can you tell us about this particular incident?
So the soldiers from the army's investigation, they were on foot. They weren't in a vehicle or anything. And during ground operations in Beit Hanoun, they were crossing a road, I guess a sort of a relatively main road in the area, and they were hit by explosive devices that had been planted there by Hamas in advance. There were, as far as I understand from the army, 3 explosive devices, and they were sort of detonated one after the other. So the first bomb hit several of the soldiers, and then other soldiers who went sort of rushed to help them were then hit by the second. And then as the third bomb was detonated, a squad or a cell of Hamas operatives, or they were sort of stationed on a nearby hill, opened fire on the area. So a very sort of well planned out ambush on these soldiers. And of course, like you mentioned, 5 soldiers were killed, 14 were wounded in this case. The army scrambled drones and fighter jets and helicopters to sort of attack the surrounding area to enable the evacuation and prevent Hamas, of course, from abducting any soldiers. There was indeed a fear during this case that Hamas could potentially abduct soldiers. And after an hour and a half or so, the incident was considered closed. And this is sort of another sort of a more unusual incident of, it's not similar to the cases where Hamas has left behind a bomb in a building, which is sort of not those aren't remotely detonated. They're more, there could be some sort of tripwire where soldiers enter the building and then it explodes. This is a case where Hamas set up 3 bombs and they were all remotely detonated, and they had a squad set up on a hill to open fire on the forces. It was a sort of a very complete ambush that are carried out by Hamas. And I think the most concerning part of this whole story is that it's taking place in Beit Hanoun. Beit Hanoun is right across from the border. It's just over a kilometer or 2 kilometers or so from Sderot. It overlooks the train line, the Sderot Ashkelon train line. It's right next to the border, and it's an area where the army has operated in dozens of times since the beginning of the war. It is important to note that in those previous operations in Beit Hanoun, the army also withdrew after the operation. This time, it's remaining in there. It's currently encircling the area, like I mentioned, and working to clear it of any operatives. The army believes that there's dozens of operatives still there, and most of them are actually underground in tunnels that have not yet been reached.
Right, because the tunnel network is so vast that the IDF has, what percentage has the IDF so far destroyed, as far as you know?
The last I heard, and this was about a month or 2 ago, that the army had demolished just around 25% of Hamas's tunnels in Gaza.
Right. And so obviously they have opportunity to hide out and pop out. But what concerns me more than the geography is, of course, very troubling, is the effectiveness of these operations, meaning they were both well planned, well executed. And we, meaning Israel, has said for about a year now that Hamas is basically toppled in terms of its military capability, but yet we're seeing these operations be very successful and very disciplined. So what does this mean to you, Manny?
I think I'll argue that I don't think Hamas is that disciplined in all areas. It really depends where, and a lot of the time, their attempted attacks on troops are not very successful, and I think even most of the time they're not very successful. But don't get me wrong, I think Hamas is still definitely has the they definitely have the ability to still attack troops, and they still want to attack troops. They're not giving up anytime soon, and that's what I think makes them so dangerous for soldiers. And they are sort of not the same military organization they were before October 7th. Before October 7th, Hamas was essentially a division, a commando division almost, that raided southern Israel and carried out the massacre on October 7th. And when troops entered Gaza, there was relatively fierce resistance for the first few months of the war. But I mean, if you just take Beit Hanoun, for example, there are cells of operatives there, several dozen operatives in Beit Hanoun. The battalion commander, as far as I understand, the Beit Hanoun battalion commander is still alive, but they're not operating like a battalion. They don't have their defenses anymore. They don't have their main command center anymore. They have to move around in places. Some of their tunnels are destroyed, not all of them. They don't really act like a battalion anymore. They don't fight the army directly. They at times will try to pop out of a tunnel and launch an attack on troops, and they are successful at times, and other times they are not. I think it's good to sort of take a step back and just think about what Hamas was nearly 2 years ago and what it is now. I think it's very different currently, their capabilities, but they still want to attack troops, and that's why they're so dangerous.
And I just worry, and this is perhaps the mother of a soldier who is currently in Gaza speaking, I just worry that the IDF is internalizing too much the fact that Hamas is basically toppled and not vigilant enough to stop these attacks, these two that we just discussed, especially the one that happened yesterday, where the individual who was killed was actually surrounded by guards who were meant to be on top of this kind of situation. So that makes me a little worried. Is the IDF still at full readiness capability?
I mean, I think it's safe to say that no. I think after this this long of a war and many months, you can see that there are soldiers. I mean, even in the standing army, there are soldiers who have been serving for 2 years in Gaza now, and it's definitely wearing them down. I think that there's no way to really deny that. They have motivation, they want to fight and everything, but there's of course there's burnout for everyone, the reservists especially. I'm sure we've talked about this plenty of times before. Reservists who have done 200, 300 days in reserves, they find it very difficult to go back. And even now, you're finding that soldiers who are drafted to the army during the war, they do their 8 months, 9 months training, and then they're immediately sent into Gaza. They don't have the same sort of experience that other soldiers had beforehand. So I think definitely the army is worn down to some extent. But of course, the army always says it learns, it's trying to improve, it's trying to get better. But this is a very big topic to discuss of if the IDF was even built for such longer wars or not. But it's a very long topic. Maybe we'll get into it another time.
Okay, that sounds like a good plan. Let's go to a short break in the meantime. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military correspondent, Emanuel Fabian. The IDF on Tuesday said it killed a key Hamas terrorist in a strike in Lebanon. The airstrike in Lebanon's northern coastal city of Tripoli on Tuesday afternoon killed Mehran Mustafa Bajur, who is a prominent Hamas commander. And this strike was extremely pinpoint, it seems to me. It was on a vehicle, if I'm not mistaken, Manny. What can you tell us?
That's correct. It was on a vehicle in Tripoli, which is, of course, all the way in the north of Lebanon. A very unusual strike. Even during the war, Israel didn't carry out many strikes in Tripoli, to my knowledge. It's an area with, I would say, limited Hezbollah influence, but there are some Hamas members sort of in that area. Hamas, of course, has a presence in Lebanon, but relatively rare and especially unusual during the ceasefire that's ongoing in Lebanon. According to the IDF, Bashar was involved in directing attacks on Israel, rocket fire on Israel during the war, on Nahariya, Kiryat Shmona, and other Israeli cities, according to the IDF statement. And he was involved also in sort of establishing Hamas's military capabilities in Lebanon over the years, in recent months as well, involved in purchasing weapons and other equipment for Hamas in Lebanon.
Okay, let's talk about another now unusual occurrence, and that is that Israeli ground troops raided several sites inside Lebanon in recent days. I don't know exactly when, with the goal of destroying Hezbollah weapon depots and other infrastructure. So, what do we know about these ground troops going inside Lebanon?
I would say in recent weeks, these operations. The army just revealed them just on Wednesday. It's important to say that Israel is still deployed to the 5 points inside southern Lebanon. These are several hundred meters in, or several dozen meters in some areas, since the November ceasefire, but rarely does it operate with ground troops beyond those areas. But it did in several recent raids. The army called them special targeted operations. In one of them, troops operated in the Jabal Blat area. It's a peak around a kilometer from the Israeli border. The army raided a Hezbollah compound there. They found a weapons depot and other facilities, and it was demolished. And then in another raid in the Labuna area, which is sort of near Rosh Hanikra, across from the border, they're also around a kilometer from the border. The troops found a multiple rocket launcher, a machine gun, explosive devices, and other weapons that were sort of hidden in this forested area, along with an underground sort of site that was used to store weapons as well. And all of that was demolished. And of course, this is rare to see ground troops operate. It's not the first time I will say, during the ceasefire. There was an operation in Hula, the Lebanese town, just a few weeks ago as well, where the army went and demolished a building there, a home there that was used by Hezbollah to observe Israeli forces. But what we're basically seeing, I think the bottom line from all of this is, along with all the strikes that we're seeing in southern Lebanon, is that Israel is enforcing the ceasefire. The ceasefire says that Hezbollah needs to remove its presence from southern Lebanon beyond the Litani River, and if the Lebanese army isn't dealing with it, and to be fair, it has been dealing with it relatively well in certain areas, then if not, then the Israeli army operates itself. It will carry out strikes. It has killed more than 180 Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon since the beginning of the ceasefire. And it, of course, in some cases also sends ground troops in to go demolish sites that it has intelligence of. And it just shows that Israel is really enforcing the ceasefire. And in response, we're seeing essentially nothing from Hezbollah. I think the only thing we saw from Hezbollah was months ago. They fired 2 mortars at the Mount Dov area, but that was it. We haven't seen any real response from Hezbollah since the beginning of the ceasefire, and I think that shows that Israel is in a position of strength here against them.
Okay, so this ground operation was a bit of a flex, but are these guns, these weapons depot, are they new or are these leftover from before the November 2024 ceasefire?
It could be some of them were from beforehand, and the army now has intelligence. But I think it's important to. I think the most important thing in the IDF statement is that they said that the weapons or the raids were intended to, quote, prevent Hezbollah from reestablishing itself in the area. So these weapons are probably from beforehand, but the army had intelligence, is my read of it. The army had intelligence that Hezbollah was working to maybe gather those weapons and bring them to a new area to reestablish their capabilities in southern Lebanon. And these raids were essentially to prevent any sort of regrouping efforts.
Okay, so also unusually, twice earlier in the week, the IDF carried out overnight raids on southern Syria, where forces captured a cell of operatives operating on behalf of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So let's hear about these reservists from the Alexandroni Brigade.
Yeah, these raids were conducted relatively close to the border. So the one that happened in I think it was on Monday, it was in the Tel Kudna area. I was actually there because one of the IDF's posts were constructed there. So the army raided a nearby Syrian village and detained, according to at least Syrian media, at least 2 people. The army didn't say exactly how many it detained, and it says that it accuses them of basically operating on behalf of the IRGC. And there was another raid a week before that, or it was several days before, it was Wednesday last week, where several other members of, I guess, affiliated with the IRGC were detained in a Syrian village close to the border. We haven't had further details given yet. Sometimes after these operations, months later, the army will reveal their names and their identities and their plans and who was behind them and who directed them, but we haven't seen that just yet. But it isn't so surprising. Syria is still going through quite big changes. Israel has said that it won't allow any armed forces in the southern Syria area, including of the new government, which to me is a little, I'd say, a bit unusual, because if you don't allow the government to operate in those areas, then somebody else will fill the void, and that could be other jihadist groups or the IRGC. So we know that there's ongoing talks between Israel and Syria. Hopefully they'll come to some sort of agreement of some kind where the Syrian government can actually exercise control in the areas close to Israel's border, and perhaps also prevent these other groups from taking a hold there. Of course, the Syrian government, the new Syrian government, is very much anti-Iran and Hezbollah and the groups that also hate Israel.
So there are a lot of talks going on with a lot of people. We're at a very pivotal moment, but it's a moment that might continue for another week or so. As you mentioned in the beginning, we are all waiting to hear what's going on in Doha and in Washington, D.C. So Manny, let's close for now. And thank you so much for joining me again today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.